My first idea was just to get a group of nails kind of like this. Mark Plano Clark, the physicist here, mounted this in an aluminum block for me. And we heated up these nails and pressed them through the plastic. And it turns out when these get hot enough to melt this plastic, that many nails close together melt essentially a massive hole in the plastic instead of small individual holes. You can make this mosquito netting with a single nail, heating it up with just fire or torch or whatever. It just takes a long time to punch a lot of holes. And so we're trying to speed that up. Another project we tried, once we found out that the nails mounted in that aluminum block weren't working, was to spread them out a little bit more. And I just tried this on this piece of wood and drilled the holes, slid the nails into the spots, and tried to melt the plastic that way. And it turns out that was very cumbersome, particularly difficult because all the nails are different heights. And at the thickness of this paper, this plastic, they really need to be all at the same height. So the cutter we're using right now, the most successful one we've had work for us so far, is just taking a simple pizza cutter and cutting in nicks around this pizza cutter such that the metal part is not bigger than 2 millimeters, at least won't leave a hole bigger than 2 millimeters. They're actually slightly smaller than 2 millimeters. This is a particularly difficult cut to make. It takes a long time to make it. We've messed up several times initially trying to do it by hand. We ended up making a jig for it and sliding it into the jig, and you can even see then we have some of these that are very small next to some that are wide. So it may take some practice. There's a big gap there. May take some practice getting these down. If you choose to do this, this is a larger pizza cutter. I don't know that I'd recommend bigger. Bigger takes a longer time to heat up. And as it turns out, this large blade area will cool off much more quickly than the small blade area, and I'll talk about that in a second. The first thing you need to do, the pizza cutter has a sharp edge, so we've ground the edge all the way off of this so it's blunt on the end. And then you need to measure out, and I just used a block of wood, put a cut. We used a bandsaw on this with a metal cutting blade, and just slid this in, made our initial cut. And then I pulled it over and took a piece of wood with a nail on it, and then slid that onto the nail so that it would force this to be just short of 2 millimeters over. And so then you could cut, turn, cut, turn, cut, turn. And you can see even with that method, these two are nice, but that one's particularly skinny. So even with that method of making a jig and trying to do it by hand, just a little bit of variability in your hand will mess this up. So you may find that you might have to cut 2 or 3 times to get a wheel that's particularly useful. And the other problem that we had with these, the other couple ideas that we came up with, this is just a standard pizza cutter we picked up at the store. I bought 3 initially thinking that I could stack 3 of these blades together, all together, we may be separated by 1 washer, and cut 3 holes at one time. And it turns out this blade will be so hot, as it melts, it'll melt a little tiny hole at each one of those spots, but if you put another hot piece of metal right next to it, it melts across that, and then you end up with this big blob of a hole as opposed to small holes that you want. And so we found that the way to cut it the quickest and most efficiently is just use a single blade. One of the other things that we found that really improves cutting time is to add washers to either side of the blade. And so we have our main pizza cutter blade right here, and then we just put a stack of washers on each side. I have 4 washers on here right now, and these are just typical washers. And what these serve as is a heat sink. We're going to be heating this whole head up and getting it essentially glowing red. And if we can get these washers really hot, they'll transfer heat from the washer out to the blade tip and keep that blade tip warmer longer. The other problem that we had when we shifted over to using a different shaft than the one that came with the pizza cutter, in this case we're just using a threaded bolt, when this gets hot, these tend to bind in on each other, and you're going to have to play with that and find the right amount of tension. You can see this is kind of loose, kind of sloppy. If you tighten this down and make it really snug, it'll catch and won't turn very well. If you loosen it up just a little bit, it'll work fine until you get it hot, and then that'll start binding and catching. So you're going to have to play with that to get the right feel so that this spins freely when it's hot, and there'll be some frustrating times doing that. And I'll show you some ways to get around some of the mistakes that you make just using this cutter. To get heat to our cutting tool, what I've been using is just a butane torch. You could use a campfire as long as the handle is insulated to some degree so you aren't going to end up burning your hand. And there's a lot of different ways to design handles that allow you to grab a hold of them even with this blade super hot. But this is what I've been using. And we'll get a little, there we go. All right. And then it takes a while to get this initially heated up, and this isn't rocket science. You just need to get in there and heat that up. If this is wet, and sometimes if and what you see smoking off of there, this is bits of plastic from the past that are burning off. What you'll find from time to time is that you're going to need to set this down and walk away from the project for a while. So what I do is actually dip this in water and completely cool it off. Just be careful when you do that. The water will actually explode on you initially. Should be still that hot. Water gets stored inside these washers, and so it takes a while to boil that water out. And you can see the tip starting to glow red, and that's an indication that at least the blade is getting to the temperature where you want it. You don't actually want to cut it with it glowing red. If you're cutting glowing red, it'll slice right through it and just make a mess of your project. So you want it to cool down off of that. But the nice thing about glowing red, it's a constant temperature. You know exactly where you are in the whole temperature scheme, so you aren't under hot or over hot. And when you're heating this, don't forget just to heat the washers themselves. If you don't heat up the washers will suck the heat out of the blade, and your blade will cool off very, very quickly. All right, so as you're heating up your blade, there's a way you can actually test this, and it works on this particular piece of wood, and you'll have to play around with this, but this is a nice way to tell. So now I have a hot blade. You can't tell by looking at it its temperature, but if I roll it across this piece of wood, if it's leaving these burn marks, then it's still too hot. And so run it across a couple of times, let it cool down a little bit, and then I take a scrap piece of wood, or scrap piece of plastic, and this is the one we're going to use later, but we'll use it for scrap now, and roll it across there. When you initially start out, now you can see real nice, in fact this is a really good example of the different temperatures within the blade. So I have kind of a cool region, one that oddly enough didn't cut at all. Perfect, this is exactly what we want to see. And then a region so cold it isn't cutting. So I don't even have a uniform temperature on my blade yet. So I'm going to heat my blade some more until I get a uniform temperature like this. Then I can go back and start cutting. If you make a cut like this all the way across your mosquito netting and find that you left out a region here, the only real feasible way to go back and get that is with a nail and do individual holes, and that dramatically increases the time it takes to make one net. So